There's no way that dog is still sitting there. That's what I said out loud to nobody in particular, gripping my paper coffee cup with both hands as I slowed my car down just a little, squinting past the frost-kissed windshield. The engine hummed low, heat finally spilling from the vents after 10 long minutes of my morning drive. It was a Tuesday, just before Thanksgiving, and the sky looked like a dirty cotton sheet hung too long in the wind. Gray, torn in places, cold. But sure enough, as I passed the same stretch of cracked rural road just outside our town limits, the golden brown shape was still there. Exactly where it had been yesterday, and the day before that. He sat like a statue on the narrow shoulder, just beyond the old railroad sign and the leaning fence with peeling white paint. His ears perked up, just barely. His fur, rough and dulled, blew gently with each breeze. The dog didn't chase cars, didn't bark, didn't lie down. Just sat, watching, waiting. I drove past. I told myself again what I'd told myself the past 2 days. It's not my business. Someone would come back for him. Maybe his owner had gone into the woods and would be right back. Maybe he belonged to a house nearby. Maybe. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. That road didn't lead anywhere but to the old collapsed grain silo and some shut-down logging trails. And the way he stared down the bend, tail curled around his side like a rope left in the rain, it wasn't curiosity in his eyes. It was hope, or something close to it. I was late for work, again. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and sighed as the dog disappeared from my rearview mirror. That evening, I pulled into the grocery store lot, still thinking about the dog. I wasn't planning on stopping again. Not after yesterday, when I'd gotten out with a piece of ham and he hadn't even moved toward me. Just watched, quietly, as if I wasn't the one he wanted to see. Inside, the store was lit with early Christmas decorations and that canned soft jazz they always play this time of year. I grabbed soup, bread, and dog food. I told myself it was for the neighbor's golden retriever. I don't even have a neighbor with a golden retriever. By the time I got back to the road, the sky was even darker. Street lamps hadn't quite turned on yet, and I had to strain to see through the windshield. And there he was, still there. I stopped the car this time. The tires crunched gently on the gravel shoulder. I turned off the ignition and opened the door slowly, trying not to scare him. But he didn't move, not even a twitch. Just those eyes, still watching the same stretch of road ahead. "Hey there," I said softly, kneeling down with the can of food and a small flashlight. The dog didn't look at me. I popped open the can, the metallic click echoing in the still air, placed it down a few feet from him, sat on the cold ground, and waited. A full 15 minutes passed. The dog didn't eat. He didn't move. He just watched. I gave up and went home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the hum of the old radiator and the soft rattle of tree branches outside my window, thinking about those eyes, that spot on the road, the way he hadn't blinked even once. The next morning I left earlier than I needed to, just to check. And he was still there. This time I sat beside him longer. I brought a blanket, left food and water, told him stories from my childhood like a fool. I said things like, "I had a dog once. Her name was Sophie." And, "You know, you don't have to wait if you don't want to." And, "Who are you waiting for, huh?" He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he didn't leave either. And that felt like something. By the 4th day, I started leaving work on my lunch break just to drive out to him. I brought better food, chicken breast, rice. I Googled the best diets for large stray dogs and tried to pretend I wasn't slowly falling into something that would break my heart, that I wasn't naming him in my head, that I didn't spend my evenings looking up missing pet reports in our county. And then, something changed. On the 5th day, just as I pulled up to the bend, I saw headlights coming from the other direction. A dusty silver pickup truck. Older model. Rusted bumper. And the dog. He stood up. It was the first time I'd seen him move. His ears perked. His tail lifted just a little. He took 2 steps forward. Then the truck passed. And the dog sat back down. I sat in my car a long time after that, heart aching in a way I didn't understand. That wasn't his truck, but he'd thought it was. He'd gotten up for it. He was still waiting for someone. I called the local shelter that night. The woman who picked up was kind. Older voice. Worn. I told her where the dog was, what I'd seen. Asked if anyone had called about a missing dog. "Not in that area, no," she said. "Are you able to get him in your car?" I said I'd try. She thanked me. Said, "These stories don't usually go well, but thank you for trying." That night, it snowed lightly. Not much, just a powder. Enough to dust the rooftops and quiet the world. I tossed and turned, dreaming of wagging tails and distant roads. By the 6th morning, I was determined. I brought a leash, a bigger blanket, real turkey this time. He was there, as always. But something was different. He wasn't sitting. He was lying down. And he was shivering. I moved faster than I ever had, crouching beside him, laying the blanket over his body, whispering soft things I didn't know I'd memorized from childhood lullabies. He blinked. His eyes met mine. Then slowly, painfully, he lifted his head just a little. And finally, he moved toward me. Just an inch. But it was enough. I sat with him in the cold morning light, steam curling from our breaths, and I knew then that I wouldn't leave without him. Whatever had happened to this dog, whoever he was waiting for, he wasn't going to wait alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't waiting anymore at all. He didn't fight me when I reached gently beneath the blanket to lift him. He was heavier than I expected, his frame large but thinner than it should have been, bones sharp beneath layers of coarse fur. I spoke softly the whole time, telling him my name, telling him it would be okay, even if I didn't quite believe it yet myself. He didn't resist, didn't growl or flinch, just looked at me with those tired, amber-colored eyes as I carefully laid him across the back seat of my car. I turned the heat up as far as it would go and drove slowly, one hand on the wheel and one glancing back every few minutes to make sure he was still okay. He didn't move much, just rested his head on a corner of the blanket and looked out the window, his breath fogging the glass slightly. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed the faint scars along his side. Thin lines. Healed over, but still there. I didn't know what they were from. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. When we pulled into my driveway, he lifted his head. Just a bit. I wondered if maybe he recognized the house, the neighborhood, the cracked flagstone path leading up to my door. But then I remembered. Of course he didn't. This wasn't where he wanted to go. This wasn't who he was waiting for. Still, when I opened the back door and held out my hand, he moved slowly, one paw at a time, until all 4 feet touched the ground again. His legs wobbled a little, and I let him lean into me, guiding him up the path and inside the house. I'd already cleared a space for him in the corner of the living room. Soft towels layered over an old quilt, a clean bowl of water, and the same turkey I'd brought earlier, now warmed in the microwave. He sniffed at it cautiously, then looked at me again. "It's yours," I said quietly, lowering myself to sit cross-legged nearby. And finally, he ate. Just a few bites at first, slow and thoughtful, like each movement still carried the memory of hunger. I watched him, barely breathing, not wanting to interrupt the moment. His body trembled slightly as he chewed, but he finished nearly all of it before collapsing slowly onto the towels, head resting on his front paws. Eyes still on me. I stayed with him most of the morning, calling into work with some excuse I don't even remember giving. The truth was, I didn't want to leave him. Something had shifted in those quiet hours. He wasn't just a dog on the side of the road anymore. He was here, in my home. And though he hadn't wagged his tail or barked or done any of the typical dog things, his silence didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, filled with things he couldn't say. That afternoon, I took him to the vet. He let me lift him again, though he was stronger now, standing a little taller on his own. The vet's office smelled like antiseptic and lavender-scented cleaner, the kind of mix that always reminded me of doctor visits when I was a kid. The receptionist, a kind woman named Darlene, gave me a sympathetic smile as she led us to an exam room. "Found him by the road?" she asked. I nodded. He was waiting for someone. I don't think they're coming back. The vet was gentle and thorough. She checked his teeth, his heart, his eyes, said he was maybe 4 or 5 years old. No microchip, no collar, just the thin scars, a small limp in his back leg, and what she called emotional fatigue. Like he'd been on alert for too long, guarding something no one could see. "He's healthy enough to recover," she said, glancing at the file. "But it'll take time. He's been through something." I nodded again. I already knew that. I brought him home and let him rest. He didn't explore the house much. Just stayed near the window, curled up beneath the softest blanket I owned. Watching. Always watching. Not the room, not me, just the window. As if he still thought, even now, that a car might pull up. That someone familiar might walk through the door. The next few days passed in a kind of quiet rhythm. I named him Scout, though he didn't respond to it. It just felt right. I'd sit with him every morning before work, gently brushing his fur or reading out loud from whatever book I had lying around. And every night, I'd return to find him in the same spot, eyes trained on the driveway, ears flicking at every sound. I told him stories about my childhood, about the dog I'd had growing up, about how I used to believe every dog in the world had a purpose. I don't know if he listened, but sometimes, when I spoke, he'd shift slightly or let out a long sigh through his nose. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. I was on the phone with my sister, standing in the kitchen with the cordless tucked between my shoulder and ear, stirring a pot of soup. Scout was lying nearby, same as always. But then he stood up, walked to the back door, and barked, just once. I dropped the spoon. My sister paused. "Was that a dog?" "Yeah," I whispered. "It was." I moved slowly to the door, opening it halfway. Scout stepped out cautiously, his paws crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. He sniffed the air, then turned back to glance at me. "You want to go for a walk?" I asked. He didn't wag his tail, but he didn't go back inside either. We walked slowly through the neighborhood. He stayed close, his nose low to the ground, ears twitching at each sound. I kept the leash loose, not wanting to make him feel trapped. Every once in a while, he'd pause, staring at a car or a shadow, then keep moving. That night, I sat beside him by the window. He didn't look out as much this time. Instead, he curled into a loose ball and rested his head on my foot. I didn't move for hours. The next day, I worked from home. Couldn't bear the thought of leaving him. I sent emails from the couch and made tea in the quiet hum of the kitchen. Scout followed me from room to room, not close enough to touch, but always nearby, like he was learning the shape of the place. Around lunchtime, I heard a knock on the door. Scout barked again, this time twice. I froze. It was a young woman, probably mid-20s, with short hair and a thick scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her eyes were wide and cautious. "Sorry to bother you," she said quickly. "I'm helping with a local rescue group. We got a tip about a dog that's been seen near the old railroad sign. Someone said he might have been picked up." I blinked. "He's here." Her eyes widened. "Really? Do you mind if I stepped aside. Scout was standing in the living room, body tense, ears forward. The woman knelt slowly, holding out her hand. He sniffed the air, then took a single step forward, then another. "You know him?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, but I think I know where he came from." She told me about a house on the far side of the county. A fire, a man who never made it out. A dog that was never found. They'd searched for weeks. Flyers, social media posts, the whole community looking. But eventually, everyone assumed the dog had moved on. Scout lowered his head, nudging her hand gently. Tears sprang to her eyes. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" I didn't know what to say. She said she'd contact the group, try to find more information, maybe track down a family member. Maybe there was someone else he was connected to. Maybe. After she left, Scout didn't return to the window. He stayed near me instead. That night, as I sat beside him, the blanket pulled over my legs and the lights dimmed low, he rested his head on my lap. And for the first time, I heard it. A soft, quiet, barely there sigh. It wasn't much, but it felt like peace, or something just as close. I didn't notice it at first, not until the following week. Something had shifted, not just in Scout, but in the house. There was a different kind of quiet now. Not the kind that pressed against your ears like fog, but a gentler stillness. Like the way a room feels when someone you care about is napping in it. Scout no longer spent his days staring out the window. He still looked up when a car passed, his ears twitching ever so slightly. But he didn't lift his whole body anymore. He didn't rush to the door. He didn't bark. He followed me more closely now. Every room I went to, he'd wander in and settle nearby, never quite underfoot, never intrusive, just there. He had a way of watching that didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like companionship. I found myself talking out loud to him even more often, narrating everything from grocery lists to random thoughts. He still hadn't wagged his tail. Not once. But I was starting to believe that maybe he didn't need to. Not yet. That Friday, I left work early and took Scout to the park. It wasn't anything fancy, just a stretch of grass and trees along the river, with picnic benches and a cracked walking trail that looped around an old fishing dock. He hadn't been on many walks yet, so I wasn't sure how he'd do, but when I opened the car door and clipped the leash to his collar, he stepped out without hesitation. The sky was soft with clouds, and the sun pushed through in patches, casting warm light over the frost-bitten grass. Scout sniffed every inch of the trail, slow and thoughtful, occasionally pausing to lift his nose into the breeze. A jogger passed us at one point, and Scout didn't flinch. He just watched, then kept walking. It felt like a kind of miracle. I brought him to a bench overlooking the river and sat down. He stood beside me for a while, then slowly lowered himself into the dirt, letting out a breath that stirred the dry leaves near his paws. I reached down and let my fingers brush behind his ears. "You're doing better," I said softly. His eyes closed, just for a moment. That night, I gave him a new toy. Nothing fancy, just a soft stuffed rabbit I'd picked up at the store. He stared at it for a long time before finally laying his head on it like a pillow. I took a picture without thinking, then stared at the image on my phone for a long time afterward. There was something about it, his expression, the lighting, the rabbit, something that made my throat tighten. I sent the picture to the rescue group, along with a short message. "Still with me. He's resting." A woman named Marie wrote back almost immediately. "So glad to hear. Still trying to contact next of kin. Nothing solid yet. Keep us posted." The next morning, a letter arrived. Not an email or a text. A real envelope. It had no return address. Inside was a single note, typed. "Thank you for finding him. His name was Beau. He waited longer than anyone expected. You can keep him if he chooses to stay. That's what he does. He chooses. No signature, no contact information, just that." I read the note twice, then 3 more times. I didn't know what to think. The name didn't feel right. Scout felt more like him, but the message stuck with me all day. I didn't show Scout the letter. Instead, I left it tucked in the back of the drawer near my bed. I didn't know if it was a hoax or something real, but it didn't matter. He was here now. That's what mattered. Over the next several days, Scout began doing something he'd never done before. He played. Not full-out, tail-wagging chaos, but little things. Nose nudges. Slow, deliberate pounces on the stuffed rabbit. Even a strange half-hop when I tossed a squeaky toy across the rug. It caught me off guard the first time, and I nearly cried. His appetite improved. He started to sleep through the night without twitching or shifting. And then, one Sunday morning, as I was pouring coffee in the kitchen, I turned to find him standing there, tail raised slightly, wagging. Just once, just a single wave, slow and uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he should. But it was there. I laughed out loud and knelt down. "There you are," I said. "You've been hiding that, haven't you?" He walked forward and rested his head against my chest. I didn't move for a long time. Later that week, the rescue group sent a volunteer named Dennis to follow up. He was older, with sun-spotted hands and a notepad filled with chicken scratch notes. He asked gentle questions about Scout's routines, his health, his behavior. "He's attached to you," Dennis said after observing us together for a while. "You've become his person." "I'm not sure he's mine yet," I replied. "I think he's still deciding." Dennis nodded. "That's fair, but I've seen a lot of these cases. Dogs who wait, dogs who lose people. They don't forget, but they do learn how to begin again." That night, I sat with Scout under the soft glow of the living room lamp and reread the letter. He lay beside me with his chin on my foot, his breathing slow and steady. "He says your name was Beau," I murmured, "but you look more like a Scout to me." I folded the letter and slipped it back in the drawer. I didn't hear from the rescue group again after that. I didn't need to. They'd done what they could. And Scout was here. The house began to feel different in small ways. I kept the door open more often. The windows, too. The corners were no longer silent. Scout made little noises now, soft sighs, the occasional grunt when shifting, even the gentle sound of his claws tapping along the hardwood as he walked from room to room. He took to watching birds from the back porch. I'd installed a small gate so he could sit outside safely, and every morning he'd be there, ears perked, eyes scanning the trees. Sometimes he'd bark once or twice. Not frantically, just a notice to the world that he was paying attention. He still didn't play with other dogs. At the park, he'd sniff them politely, then return to my side. But he didn't tremble. He didn't flinch. That was enough. Then one evening I found something buried in the blankets of his bed. A photograph. Just a corner of one, creased and faded. It must have been caught in the lining of the old quilt I'd given him. I hadn't noticed it before. The photo was of a man, middle-aged, flannel shirt, thick beard. He was kneeling beside a golden-brown dog. My heart stuttered. Scout. There was no date, no names, just the image. But the resemblance was clear. The shape of his ears, the stripe along his muzzle. This was his person. Once. I didn't cry. I just stared at the photo for a long time. Later, I placed it gently on the table near Scout's bed. He looked at it once, then lay down beside it. And that night, for the first time, he wagged his tail in his sleep. The days began to slip into each other. December rolled forward with its early darkness and silver frost. I decorated the house lightly, some lights along the porch, a small tree in the corner. Scout didn't knock anything over, didn't chew on the ornaments. He just sat nearby, always near. One morning, I found him sitting beside the tree, his nose pressed gently against one of the wrapped gifts. It wasn't food, just a scarf. But he seemed fascinated by it, as if he knew it meant something. I reached down and ruffled his fur. "You've come a long way, huh?" He looked up at me, eyes soft, and for the first time, just for a moment, his tongue flicked out and licked my hand. It was the smallest of gestures, but it felt like the whole world cracked open a little wider. The weather turned colder just after the new year. The kind of cold that seeped into the spaces between the floorboards and made you wince when your bare feet touched the tile. I started layering thicker socks and stacking blankets on the end of the couch, but Scout seemed to welcome the chill. He'd curl near the back door, staring out into the white-covered yard, nose twitching at scents I couldn't begin to imagine. There were still no new letters, no calls from the rescue group, no mysterious visitors. Just the days, one after another, and Scout at my side. I didn't know what to expect anymore. Every time I thought I understood him, he shifted again. Not in some dramatic, sweeping way, but in those quiet adjustments he made when no one was looking. He began to sit a little closer when I worked on my laptop. He started sleeping in my room, tucked quietly in the corner on his folded quilt. And sometimes, when I got up in the night to get water, I'd catch him watching me from the shadows of the hallway, his eyes soft and curious. I didn't question it anymore. I just said goodnight, and he would settle again. By mid-January, I took him to the lake. It wasn't far, just a few miles outside town, with a winding trail and frozen shoreline that reflected the sky like old glass. I kept him leashed, though he walked without pulling. His steps were steady now, more confident. We stopped often, mostly because I was still getting used to walking in snow boots. Scout didn't seem to mind. He paused when I paused, waited when I tied my laces, kept pace even when the wind picked up and pushed against us like a breath from the trees. At the lake, I stood for a while staring across the water. Everything was still. Scout sat beside me, tail resting gently on the icy ground. A few geese moved in the distance, honking low and rhythmic. He didn't flinch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small biscuit. He accepted it gently, his teeth barely brushing my fingers. "You're not really waiting anymore, are you?" I asked. He looked up at me, then turned back to the lake. That night I noticed something strange. Scout stood in the hallway staring at the coat closet. He didn't move, didn't scratch or bark, just stared. I watched him for a while before kneeling down beside him. "What do you see?" I whispered. He looked at me, then back to the door. I opened it. There was nothing inside but old jackets, a pair of hiking boots I never wore, and a box of holiday decorations I hadn't put up this year. But Scout stepped forward, nosing past the coats until he reached the back corner. Then he sat. I waited. After a moment, he stood again and turned back toward the living room, as if he'd checked something off a list. He did the same thing 3 nights in a row. Always at the same hour. Always the same motion. Standing quietly at the door, then moving on. On the 4th night, I waited for him. When he approached the closet, I opened it before he could stop. He paused, then looked up at me as if surprised. I knelt down and began moving the coats aside, checking each item carefully. Then I saw it. Tucked behind the holiday box near the floor was a thin wool scarf. One I hadn't worn in years. One I barely remembered owning. But the moment I pulled it free, Scout moved forward and gently pressed his nose to it. He stayed like that for a long time. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know if it reminded him of someone or something. But he seemed calmer afterward, like he'd found something familiar in the scent. I left the scarf on the edge of his bed. The following week, we had our first heavy snowfall. I shoveled the walk while Scout sat on the porch, watching the snowflakes drift and dance. He looked content there, like he belonged in that quiet scene. A neighbor waved from across the street, and I waved back, not bothering to explain the dog sitting like a statue behind me. People had started recognizing him around town. A few even stopped to ask about him. I always gave the same answer. He showed up when he needed to. He's home now. At night, I read to him sometimes. Not long books, just pages from old favorites or things I found in the attic. He liked the sound, or maybe he liked the presence. I'd read, and he'd rest his head on the folded quilt, his eyes half closed. One night, while reading a story about a boy and his dog who traveled across the mountains, I looked up to find Scout watching me more intently than usual. When I finished the passage, I closed the book and set it down. "You miss him, don't you?" His gaze didn't shift. "I don't know if I'll ever be that person, the one you were waiting for, but if you want to stay, if you want this to be your place, I'll make sure you're never alone again." Scout rose and walked to where I sat. Then, slowly, he leaned his body against my side. We stayed like that for a long time. In February, the house got quieter again. Not in a sad way, just in that winter way. Days shorter, evenings darker, nights stretching on like fabric across a cold floor. Scout and I developed our routines, morning walks, afternoon naps near the heater, evenings watching old movies with the sound turned low. He barked more now. Not much, but enough to surprise me. At squirrels, at the mail truck, once at a falling branch, but never at people. He watched people with the calm of someone who'd seen too much to be startled by the ordinary. We went to the lake more often, even when it snowed. I started bringing a thermos of tea, and he'd sit beside me as I sipped. The two of us wrapped in quiet companionship. One day, we saw a group of children sledding on the far hill. Scout perked up at the sound of their laughter. He didn't run toward them, just watched, his ears forward, his tail brushing the snow. Then, slowly, he took a few steps in their direction. I followed, keeping the leash loose. The kids noticed him and waved. One of them, a little girl with bright pink mittens, held out a hand. Scout stopped a few feet away and sat. She giggled. "He's so pretty." "He's the best," I said. She looked up at me. "What's his name?" "Scout?" She nodded seriously. "Like the one from the book?" "Something like that." After they left, Scout turned to me and licked my hand. Just once, then began walking back to the trail. That night, I printed out the photo we'd found weeks before, the one of him and the man in the flannel shirt. I framed it and set it on the bookshelf. I didn't do it to keep the past alive. I did it because it felt like honoring something. A chapter that mattered. A memory that deserved to have a place. Scout didn't react to the photo, but he sniffed it once as he passed. Then curled up in his usual spot beside the heater. I thought about the letter again. About the part that said, "You can keep him if he chooses to stay." It stayed with me. And every morning when I woke up and saw him still there, eyes blinking sleepily as the sunlight filtered through the blinds, I whispered the same words. "You chose to stay." The first time Scout howled, it was almost midnight. The sound came low and quiet, like a note half buried in wind, rising from the shadows at the foot of the stairs. I had been dozing off on the couch, a book cradled loosely in my hand, and the fire down to just embers. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again. I sat up slowly. Scout was standing by the front door, ears pointed, body still. He didn't move when I approached, just kept looking out through the glass panel, as if something beyond the porch had called to him. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're safe." He didn't howl again. He simply turned, padded across the rug, and lay down by my feet. I ran my fingers through his fur until he fell asleep. After that night, the house felt different again. Not in a way I could explain, more like something unseen had passed through. A breeze through a closed window, a thought you couldn't quite catch. Scout seemed more alert, more aware. Like he was waiting again, but not for a person, for a moment. It rained for 3 days after that. Long, soaking rains that turned the backyard into soft mud and filled the gutters with leaves I hadn't cleared. Scout didn't mind. He watched the rain the same way he watched snowfall. Calm, still, his head tilted like he understood something I didn't. I worked from home those days, grateful for the excuse not to commute. I set up a desk near the window so I could watch the backyard while answering emails. Scout curled nearby, sometimes resting his head on my foot. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped. I opened the back door and let the wind blow through. Scout stood at the threshold for a long time before stepping out onto the wet grass. His paws sank slightly into the earth, and he sniffed the air with slow, deliberate breaths. I followed, coffee mug in hand, letting the cold seep into my skin. We walked the perimeter of the yard. I pointed out the fresh paw prints near the fence, likely raccoons or stray cats. Scout paused at each one, nose twitching. He didn't bark. He didn't chase. He was just aware. Later that day, I found him staring at the bookshelf again. Not at the framed photo this time, but at the lower shelf where I kept old albums. I sat down beside him and pulled one out. It was covered in dust. I hadn't opened it in years. We looked at the pictures together. Family photos, vacations, the old house I grew up in. Scout didn't react much, but he stayed beside me, his chin resting on the edge of the couch. At one point, I found a photo of my childhood dog, Sophie, a scruffy mutt with wild hair and one ear that never stood straight. She was good, I told him. Not always smart, but good. Scout leaned closer, nose brushing the plastic sleeve. Sometimes I wonder if dogs remember each other, I said. If there's something passed down, like a scent trail that never fully fades. He licked my hand, just once, then settled down again. The next day, the power went out. A late winter windstorm knocked down a transformer on the edge of town, and the whole neighborhood went dark. I lit candles, found the old camping lantern, and filled a pot with water to boil on the gas stove. Scout seemed unbothered, moving through the dim house with the ease of someone used to navigating shadows. We sat in the living room, wrapped in blankets, the flicker of flame painting long shapes on the walls. I told stories. Real ones, made-up ones, memories half true and half imagined. Scout listened, or at least he didn't leave, and somewhere between stories, I realized how natural it felt to have him there. As if he had always belonged in this house, in this rhythm. The power returned the next morning. I missed the candles more than I expected. That weekend, I decided to repaint the spare room. Not for any reason, just because. The walls had been a dull beige since I moved in. I chose a soft green, something that reminded me of spring. Scout lay just outside the door as I worked, occasionally rising to inspect my progress before returning to his spot. At one point, I stepped back to look at the wall and found a paw print in the fresh paint. I turned to see Scout sitting innocently in the hallway, tail swishing once. I didn't clean it, just painted around it. "It's your room too," I told him. In early March, the ice on the lake began to break. Not all at once, but in slow, deliberate cracks that echoed like thunder across the water. We were there one morning, watching from the dock. Scout stood with his paws on the edge, staring down at the dark water below. "It's changing," I whispered. "Just like you." He looked up at me, then nudged my leg with his nose. On the way home, we passed a group of hikers resting near the trailhead. One of them, a boy, maybe 10, stood and pointed. "Is that the dog from the road?" he asked. I paused. "What do you mean?" "We used to drive by him every day. My mom cried about it sometimes. She said he was waiting for someone who wouldn't come back." Scout stood still beside me. "He came home with me," I said quietly. The boy nodded. "He looks better now." "He is." Back at the house, I gave Scout a new toy, a braided rope with knots on each end. He took it gently and carried it to his bed. That evening, I caught him chewing on it, his head tilted in concentration. It was the most playful I'd seen him since the day he arrived. The next morning, I found the rope toy by the front door, like he'd left it there for someone. Or maybe just wanted me to see. Mid-March brought the first real signs of spring. Buds on the trees, birdsong early in the morning, the world outside thawing. Scout began spending more time by the open windows, his ears flicking at the sounds of returning life. One night, as we walked through the neighborhood, a woman stopped her car in the road and leaned out. "Is that the dog who used to sit out by the tracks?" she asked. "Yes. I used to leave sandwiches sometimes. He never ate them. Just looked at me like I wasn't the right one." "He was waiting," I said. She nodded. "I'm glad he's not anymore." Neither of us said anything else. She drove away. Scout and I stood there for a while, just listening to the wind. That night, I made him a small bed at the foot of mine. He hadn't slept there before, always preferring his own corner. But this time, when I turned out the light, I heard him rise, walk slowly across the room, and curl onto the new blanket. I didn't move, just whispered into the dark, "Good night, Scout." He sighed. It was a quiet sound, but I heard it clearly. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows. And for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like winter anymore. By April, the snow was completely gone. The grass began to wake up, stretching in uneven green patches across the yard, and the air carried that particular scent of wet earth and thawed stone. Scout took to lying on the back porch in the early afternoons, his front paws stretched long, and his head resting just past the edge of sunlight. He seemed to enjoy the warmth on his fur. Sometimes I'd sit with him, sipping coffee or reading, and he'd press his shoulder lightly against my leg, not asking for attention, just anchoring himself there. That month, I began planting a small vegetable bed along the side of the house, just tomatoes, peppers, and a few herbs. Nothing ambitious. Scout followed me back and forth from the shed, occasionally digging shallow holes when I wasn't watching. He'd pause afterward and look up like he was waiting to see if I'd scold him. I never did. I'd just smile and fill the hole back in. He seemed satisfied with that exchange. Neighbors started stopping by more often, waving over the fence or walking over with a pie or a potted plant. One woman, named Janet, brought over a box of homemade biscuits for Scout. He sniffed them gently and took one with a careful mouth, chewing slowly like he wasn't used to such softness. She watched him the entire time, eyes glistening slightly. "I drove past him for a month," she said quietly. "I never stopped. I always wanted to. My kids begged me to. But I thought someone else would." "He waited a long time," I said. She reached down and touched the fur along his back. "And now?" I looked at him. His tail gave a single, small wag. "Now he's home." That evening, I went through a box of old photos and mementos I'd stored in the attic. Scout lay beside me on the floor, his head resting on a cushion as I sorted. I found a photo of my grandparents' farm, the wide porch and sloped barn where I'd spent summers as a child. There had been dogs there too, farm dogs with matted coats and watchful eyes, loyal in ways I hadn't understood at the time. I showed the photo to Scout. He sniffed it, then turned his head to look at me. "You'd have liked it there," I told him. "Big fields, quiet mornings, fresh eggs and bacon every day." He yawned and blinked slowly. That night it rained hard. Thunder rolled low across the sky, and the house shook slightly with the wind. I got up to check the windows and found Scout already sitting in the hallway, ears perked, but body still. "You okay?" I asked. He looked at me, then walked toward the bedroom. I followed. He curled up at the foot of the bed again, just like he had started doing most nights. I sat on the edge and reached down to stroke his back. The storm rattled the windows, but he didn't move. "You're not afraid of storms, are you?" His eyes closed slowly. We spent the next morning cleaning branches from the yard. Scout carried one around for nearly half an hour before finally dropping it near the porch. I praised him like he'd solved a crime, and he seemed to enjoy the fuss. I noticed something different that afternoon. He stood in the hallway again, staring at the coat closet. But this time, he didn't wait for me to open it. He simply sat there, staring for a few seconds, and then walked away. It hadn't been part of our routine in weeks. Something had shifted. 2 days later, a letter came. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I heard you found him. I don't know how to say thank you." He waited longer than anyone could have asked. I was the one who used to drive out there and check every week, but then I moved out west. Couldn't keep coming. Couldn't keep watching. He was my brother's dog. He died in the fire. I thought Scout had too. I guess he didn't. The letter ended there. No name, no return address. Just the folded paper and the weight it carried. I read it twice, then left it on the table. Scout sniffed it once and then looked at me. I think he meant to say goodbye, I told him. Or maybe just, thank you. Scout walked to his bed and lay down. That week, I took him to a groomer for the first time. He'd tolerated baths at home, but this was different. The woman, Molly, greeted him with a soft voice and slow hands. She brushed and washed and trimmed. When she was done, he looked lighter somehow. Not just cleaner, calmer, like he'd let go of something. He's special, she said as we checked out. He really is. We stopped by the lake on the way home. Scout walked out onto the dock and sat at the edge. I sat beside him. The sun was beginning to set, coloring the water with streaks of gold and rose. I think you knew he was gone, I whispered. But it took you time to accept it, to be ready. Scout pressed his side against me, warm and solid. The next morning, he did something he'd never done before. As I poured my coffee and looked out the kitchen window, he came up behind me and nudged my hand with his nose. I turned. He was holding the rope toy. You want to play? He wagged his tail. We spent the next half hour in the backyard, the two of us chasing and tugging and laughing. Yes, laughing. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd done that. Scout pounced and wrestled and even barked once. It was sharp and joyous. A sound of presence, not fear. When we finally collapsed on the grass, breathless, he rolled onto his side and looked at me with those eyes that had once held only sorrow. They were different now. Lighter. That night, I added a new photo to the shelf. Just the two of us, sitting by the lake, the sun behind us, Scout's head against my shoulder. I didn't write anything on the back. I didn't need to. The house no longer felt like mine. It felt like ours. And every morning after that, when I woke up and saw him there, already watching me with soft eyes and a quiet presence, I understood something I hadn't before. He hadn't been waiting for someone to return. He'd been waiting for somewhere to begin again. And every day, step by step, he was choosing to begin with me. The first time Scout ran, really ran, it was late high April, and the sky was wide open with streaks of pale blue and soft gold. We'd driven out to an old open field a few miles past town, a place I'd remembered from childhood that used to be part of an old farm, now just rolling space with a dirt path along the edge. I hadn't planned on letting him off leash, but something about the way he looked out the window as we pulled up, ears perked and breath fogging the glass, made me pause. Want to try? I asked. Scout looked at me, then the door. I unlatched the leash, let it slip from my hand. For a moment he stayed still, watching me. Then he took a step forward, then another, and then he ran. He didn't run in circles or chase after anything. He ran straight ahead, tail high, legs kicking up bits of dry grass behind him. I stood in the middle of the field and watched as he darted through the open space, the wind rushing through his fur, the sound of his paws thudding gently against the earth. It wasn't wild or frantic. It was clean, free, like something old had been cracked open and let loose. After a few minutes, he slowed and turned, bounding back toward me. When he reached me, he didn't stop, just brushed past my leg and circled around, running again. I laughed, the sound catching in my throat, and I ran too. Not far, just a few paces, enough to feel the wind in my own lungs. We stayed until the sun dipped low enough that the shadows reached across the field. Scout was panting, tongue out, eyes brighter than I'd ever seen. I filled his water bowl and sat beside him, legs stretched, heart still thudding from something deeper than exertion. "You needed that," I said. He leaned his head against my shoulder. We came back to the field almost every weekend after that. He began to recognize the path, the way the gate creaked open, the way my hand lingered on the latch before letting him go. It became our ritual. On weekdays, we stuck to the neighborhood, but Saturdays were for running. One afternoon, a boy was flying a kite near the hill. Scout paused to watch, his head tilted. The kite dipped and soared with the wind, trailing red and yellow ribbons. The boy waved at us, and Scout barked. A single, bright sound that caught the boy's attention. "He likes it," the boy called out. I smiled. He likes a lot of things now. Back home, I found myself rearranging the house in small ways. I cleared space by the living room window where Scout liked to nap in the afternoon sun. I set his bowl by the back door, where the light hit the tile just right. I moved the bookshelf in my room to make space for his bed. These were small adjustments, but they changed the flow of things. One night, while sitting on the porch, a neighbor walked by with her 2 dogs. She waved and paused at the edge of the lawn. "He seems so different now," she said, looking at Scout. "He is." "What changed?" I thought for a moment. "I think he just needed to know he wasn't alone." She nodded. "That's all any of us need." Scout didn't bark. He stood beside me, tail gently swaying. In early May, I got a call from the rescue group. It had been months since I'd heard from them. Marie's voice sounded surprised, almost cautious. "I don't want to startle anything," she said, "but we had someone reach out. A woman who says she knew your dog. She was a friend of the man who passed. She said she might have something that belongs to Scout." I hesitated. "What kind of something?" "A toy, a blanket. She said she recognized him from a photo we posted months ago." I agreed to meet. We chose a public park, neutral ground. Scout sat beside me on the bench, his posture calm but watchful. The woman was older, maybe in her 60s, with short gray hair and kind eyes. She walked slowly, carrying a cloth tote. "His name was Bo back then," she said. "He belonged to Sam, my neighbor. They were close. You could see it. The kind of bond people talk about but rarely understand." She reached into the bag and pulled out a small, worn bandana. It was faded red, frayed along the edges. "This used to be his," she said, holding it out. Scout sniffed it carefully. His nose moved slowly, pausing at a corner. Then he leaned forward and gently took the bandana in his mouth. The woman's eyes welled. "He remembered." I swallowed. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." She nodded and stood silently for a moment before turning to go. Back home, I folded the bandana and placed it on the shelf near the photo. Scout walked over, gave it one more sniff, then lay down beside it. That evening, he rested his head on my lap while I read. I didn't finish the chapter. I just let my hand move slowly through his fur, listening to the sound of his breathing. In the mornings now, he would bring me things, not toys, little gifts. A pine cone, a sock from the laundry. Once, a small stick from the porch. He'd drop it beside me, then sit and wait. "Thank you," I'd say, and he'd walk away, content. He had become a quiet shadow in every part of the house. When I cooked, he sat near the pantry. When I folded clothes, he lay near the bed. If I showered, I'd open the door to find him waiting in the hall. He didn't demand anything, just showed up. One night in mid-May, I had a nightmare. One of those deep, cold dreams that leaves you half awake, heart pounding. I sat up, disoriented. Scout was there. He rose from his bed, walked over, and laid his head across my knees. I hadn't said a word. He just knew. I reached down, both hands trembling, and held on to him until I could breathe again. After that night, I left the door open a little wider. The garden began to sprout by the end of the month. Tiny green shoots pressing upward. I pointed them out to Scout one by one, narrating their names like a proud teacher. Tomato, basil, bell pepper, you can't eat them yet. He followed me closely, tail brushing my legs. We went back to the field that weekend. He ran again, farther this time. A full loop, then another. When he returned, I clipped the leash back on, but he didn't pull. He walked beside me, his head held high. At the gate, I paused. "You ready to go home?" He looked up. His tail wagged once. Back at the house, I made us dinner. Grilled chicken and rice for him. Pasta for me. We ate in the kitchen with the window open, the sound of crickets drifting in. Scout finished his meal, then walked over and lay at my feet. I didn't speak, just reached down and rested my hand gently on his back. The house no longer felt like a place with walls and rooms. It felt like breath, like rhythm, and Scout, with his steady presence and quiet wisdom, was part of it all. Whatever he'd been waiting for once. He wasn't looking anymore. He was here. And so was I. June came in softly, the way a curtain sways when the windows are open just wide enough to invite the world inside. Mornings began earlier, light sneaking through the blinds long before my alarm, and Scout adjusted right along with it. He would wake with the sun, quietly stretching his legs and shaking his fur out in the corner of the room before padding softly to the foot of the bed to sit and wait for me to stir. Not barking, not whining, just waiting, patiently, for our day to begin. I began to let him lead our walks. We had our routes, our usual turns, but I stopped tugging the leash or choosing the direction. Instead, I'd clip it on, open the gate, and say, "Your call today." And he would choose. Down to the lake trail, through the older part of town where the sidewalks buckled and roses bloomed in wild tangles, sometimes up the hill past the school, where rabbits darted between hedges and Scout would freeze, tail twitching, then simply watch them go. He never chased. He never lunged. He observed the world the way someone does when they've had to rebuild their trust in it, one piece at a time. At home, I rearranged the spare room again. Not for any practical reason. I moved the bookshelf out, rolled up the old rug, brought in a second-hand armchair I'd found at a local thrift store. I filled the corners with quiet things. Potted plants, a basket of Scout's toys, the photo of us by the lake. It became our room for doing nothing, for reading, for sitting, for breathing. Scout seemed to know it was his space. He'd disappear in there some afternoons, lying with his back to the chair and his front paws extended toward the sunlight. Once, I peeked in and found him asleep on his back, tongue sticking slightly out, one paw twitching like he was chasing something in his dream. I didn't wake him. The garden grew faster than expected. The tomato plants shot up, the basil thickened, and I caught Scout sniffing the mint patch more than once. I let him. It didn't hurt anything. He liked the scent, and I liked watching him explore. One afternoon, I caught him lying with his nose pressed to the dirt, eyes fixed on a single snail crawling slowly across a rock. He didn't bark or prod or try to pick it up. He just watched it move inch by inch. I sat beside him for almost 20 minutes, doing the same. I got a letter that week, from the rescue group again, just a short one. Still no other relatives found. We believe he was meant to be with you. Thank you for giving him a place to rest. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. That weekend, I bought Scout a new collar. His old one still fit, but this one was softer, made from a woven brown fabric that matched the undertones in his fur. I chose it because it felt like something he'd wear if he had a say in the matter. I sat him down in the living room, gently removed the old collar, and slid the new one around his neck. He tilted his head slightly, then sneezed once. "You look good," I told him. He walked over to the mirror in the hallway, the one he never paid attention to, and sat facing it for a long moment. I don't know what he saw. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. One evening, a thunderstorm moved through. Fast. Loud. The kind that knocks out lights for blocks at a time. I lit the lanterns and moved to the living room, expecting Scout to retreat to the hallway or his bed. Instead, he followed me to the couch and jumped up beside me. He'd never done that before. He pressed against my side, his head tucked just under my arm. I wrapped the blanket around us both and whispered whatever came to mind until the thunder moved further off. We stayed like that for hours, the air heavy with rain and electricity, the windows glowing from the candlelight. The next morning, I found his rope toy at the edge of the bed. He'd left it there without a sound. I picked it up, smiled, and tucked it under my pillow. Summer brought more visitors. Friends dropping by with coffee. Neighbors waving over the fence. A couple of kids from the block came around asking if Scout could play. He didn't know what to do with them at first. He'd watch, alert but gentle, as they ran through the yard or rolled a ball his way. Then, one day, he picked up the ball in his mouth and dropped it near the youngest boy's feet. They played for nearly an hour after that. The boy's mother stopped me as they left. "I've never seen him like that," she said. "He's so careful, like he knows they're small." "He's got a good heart," I said. I meant it more than I realized. Later that evening, after the kids had gone home and the sun had dropped behind the trees, Scout stood at the back door staring out at the yard. I opened it for him, and he walked out, sat in the grass, and looked up at the sky. It was clear that night. Stars pricked the dark like tiny pins, and I sat beside him in the cool grass, looking up too. He lay down eventually, his head resting on my foot. I stayed quiet. The silence between us was comfortable, not filled, not strained, just present. It had taken months to get here, from the side of the road to this backyard under stars, from waiting to belonging, from guarded silence to this easy stillness. And though neither of us said a word, I think we both understood it the same way. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. Every morning after that seemed softer, not easier, just more whole. Scout greeted the day not with barks or bounding energy, but with quiet purpose. A stretch, a slow walk to the window, a soft glance my way, like a question he already knew the answer to. Are we still here? Yes. we are. And tomorrow, we will be again. By late July, the heat settled in like an old quilt you couldn't quite shake off. The mornings were still bearable, quiet and warm with a breeze that carried just enough cool from the night to pretend it was comfortable. Scout and I took our walks earlier and earlier, sometimes before the sun had fully breached the rooftops. The streets were quieter then. Just us, the robins, and the occasional paper delivery truck making its rounds with a tired groan. Scout was slower now. Not tired in the way that meant something was wrong. Just relaxed. Content. He didn't rush down the trails or zigzag at the scent of rabbits anymore. He walked in a straight line, eyes scanning the road ahead, as though he were reading the morning like a familiar book. That month, we took our last trip to the field. I hadn't known it was the last when we left the house. The car ride was quiet. The windows cracked open just enough for the wind to slip through and dance along the edge of Scout's fur. He sat in the back seat with his head low on the armrest, watching the road like he always did. When we arrived, he stepped out slowly, pausing before he began his usual loop. He didn't run this time. Instead, he walked to the middle of the field and lay down in the tall grass, facing the distant tree line. I walked over and sat beside him. He didn't move. Just breathed in deeply, then let the breath go in a soft huff that rustled the wildflowers near his muzzle. We stayed there for over an hour. I didn't say anything. He didn't ask for anything. The wind picked up near the end, rustling the grass like waves across the earth. When Scout stood, it was with a slow, steady motion. No limp, no hesitation, just deliberate quiet. We walked back to the car together. That night he curled at the foot of the bed and didn't move for hours. Even in sleep, his breathing was slow and even, as if he'd reached a place where no part of him needed to stay alert anymore. The garden began to overflow with life. Tomatoes ripened on the vine, and the basil nearly overtook the other herbs. I brought in baskets of vegetables every morning, and Scout followed me from sink to counter to fridge, occasionally sniffing the basket like he was doing his share of the harvest. Neighbors kept stopping by. Janet brought lemonade and asked how Scout was doing. Others came with small gifts, treats, flowers, notes about how they used to see him on the roadside all those months ago. It was like the whole town had been waiting with him, in their own silent way. One evening, just as the sun started to slip behind the trees, Scout did something he hadn't done in a while. He brought me the bandana, the old one, faded and frayed. He dropped it at my feet, then sat and looked up. I knelt beside him. "You want to keep this close tonight?" He blinked slowly, and I took that as a yes. I tied it gently around his neck, the way it must have been before. It didn't fit quite the same. His fur had grown in, thick and healthy, but he didn't seem to mind. He slept that night with his head resting on my shoe. Not his blanket, not the cushion, just my shoe. The next morning was still, too still. I found him in the corner of the room, tucked into his bed, eyes closed. For a second, I thought he was asleep. I even whispered his name before I realized there was no breath rising beneath the bandana. I sat beside him for a long time. I don't remember how long. I stroked his fur, soft behind the ears, down the ridge of his back. I whispered the same things I had always whispered when he was frightened, or tired, or dreaming. "You're safe. You're home. You did so good." I buried him in the field. The owner of the land, an older man named Hal, had seen us there before. When I explained, he didn't hesitate. "He loved this place," Hal said, wiping his brow. "He can stay here, always." I chose a spot under the maple, the one that turned gold in the fall. I placed the photo of us from the lake inside a weatherproof box and left it with him. I tied the bandana around a low branch. It flutters there now when the wind blows just right. Back home, the house felt heavier that first night. I didn't try to fill the silence. I let it rest. But something changed the next morning. When I stepped into the garden, the tomatoes were gone from the vine. Every last one. Plucked clean. No signs of birds or animals. Just empty stems and one small pine cone sitting in the dirt. The same kind Scout had used to bring me. I smiled, just a little. And I whispered, "Thank you." I still leave the back door open some mornings. I still keep his collar on the hook beside my coat. And when I walk past the field, I always look toward the tree line, just in case. He waited a long time for someone who never came back. But he didn't leave empty. He gave me something I didn't know I needed, and now I wait too. But not with sorrow, with gratitude, for all the mornings, for all the silence. For every step we took, side by side, he came into my life waiting. He left knowing he was loved. And somewhere in the breeze, just beyond the gate, I still hear the quiet sound of paws in the grass. Still here, still home. Sometimes I dream of him. Not sad dreams. Dreams where we are walking again, down a quiet street that feels familiar but doesn't exist in real life. In the dream, Scout is always just ahead, leading the way but looking back every so often to make sure I'm still with him. I always am. And in those dreams I never want to wake up. The town remembers him too. I've seen it in the mural that a group of students painted on the side of the community center. A dog sitting by the road, head lifted, watching the horizon. They never asked permission. They never needed to. Everyone understood who it was. In early autumn, I planted a tree in the backyard. A sapling maple, small and fragile. I placed one of Scout's toys, the frayed rope, beneath the soil before patting it down and watering the roots. It felt right, letting something grow from what he left behind. Each year, it'll grow taller. Each year, it'll shade the garden. Each year, it'll remind me of a dog who waited and then chose to stay. People still ask about him. Sometimes I just nod. Sometimes I tell them the whole story. I've learned there's a certain kind of person who needs to hear it, a kind of quiet ache behind their questions that Scout would have understood better than I ever could. I tell those people about how he sat in the same place for days, how he didn't move when I offered food, how his silence was its own kind of language. I tell them how he finally followed me home. And always, always, I tell them about the last morning, about the bandana, about the pine cone, about how the house still feels full even after he's gone. Love doesn't leave. It just changes shape. And Scout shaped it into something I get to carry with me now. Some evenings, I drive to the edge of town and walk the trail by the lake. Not because I expect to find him there, but because it reminds me of the early days, of how far we both traveled without moving much at all. I sit on the same bench where we used to stop. Sometimes I bring a thermos of tea, sometimes just myself. I watch the water, the way it catches the light, and I listen. Not for footsteps, not for barking, just for the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something has finally found peace. And every once in a while, a breeze will move through the trees in just the right way, and I'll close my eyes and feel it, like he's there again, like he never really left.